The results came back 3 days later. The scientists sat in silence. They ran the numbers again, then a third time. The equipment wasn't malfunctioning, the film wasn't damaged, the stopwatch wasn't broken. What they had recorded on high-speed camera in a controlled laboratory, witnessed by trained researchers, was physically impossible. According to every known model of human neuromuscular response, what Bruce Lee had just done could not happen. The human nervous system doesn't work that fast, except his did. Rewind to 1962. Not a gym, not a film set, not a dark alleyway behind a Hong Kong nightclub. A university laboratory, Long Island, New York. The kind of place where men in white coats measure things in fractions of seconds, where the body is reduced to data points and reaction curves and kinetic force equations written on chalkboards nobody outside the building will ever read. Nobody expected Bruce Lee to walk through that door, and nobody expected him to break everything they thought they knew about human speed. Let's go back further. Let's understand what made this moment possible, and why, 60 years later, scientists are still arguing about it. Bruce Lee was 21 years old when he arrived in America. He came with nothing except what lived inside his body. He had no gym membership, no connections, no money worth speaking of. He had a duffel bag, a mind that never stopped calculating, and hands that moved faster than most people could blink. He enrolled at the University of Washington, philosophy major. That detail matters, because the way Bruce Lee approached combat was never purely physical. It was intellectual, philosophical. He didn't just train his muscles, he interrogated them. He questioned every movement. He asked why at every step. Why does a punch travel this path and not that one? Why does muscle tension slow the strike? Why do fighters telegraph before they commit? While other students partied on weekends, Bruce Lee sat alone with a notepad, sketching trajectories, drawing lines of force, calculating angles. He was building something no martial arts school could teach him, because no school had ever thought this way before. By 1964, word had started to travel. Not through newspapers, not through television, through whispers. The kind of whispers that move through martial arts circles the way fire moves through dry grass, quietly at first, then everywhere all at once. There was a Chinese kid in Seattle who could do something nobody else could do. He could hit you before you saw him move. Not metaphorically, not as an expression. Literally. Physically. His fist would arrive at your face before your eyes registered that his shoulder had shifted. Old school martial artists heard this and laughed. Boxers heard it and rolled their eyes. Physicists heard it and said, impossible. Because here's what physiology tells us. The average human reaction time, the window between your brain perceiving a threat and your body responding, is 200 to 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second. That's not an opinion. That's a measurement. Electrodes, labs, decades of data. For a strike to land before a trained opponent can react, it has to travel from launch to impact in under that window. No human being had ever done that consistently. No human being was supposed to be able to.
His name was Dr. Jun Rhee. No, wait. Let's go to the moment that started everything. The moment a man walked into Bruce Lee's life and handed him an impossible challenge wrapped in a smile. His name wasn't important. What mattered was what he represented. He was a physicist, mid-30s, worked out of a research institute on the East Coast. He had been studying human biomechanics for 6 years, specifically the limits of muscular contraction speed and neurological firing rates in elite athletes. He had tested sprinters. He had tested Olympic fencers. He had tested professional baseball pitchers whose fastballs crossed the plate at over 90 miles per hour. And he had concluded, with data, with peer-reviewed certainty, that there was a hard ceiling on human strike speed. No one was breaking it. Then someone showed him a 16-millimeter reel of footage. It was grainy, shot in a Hong Kong gymnasium in poor light. The film lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds. He watched it once and didn't say anything. He watched it again. Then he watched it frame by frame. The man on screen, lean, almost impossibly relaxed, was demonstrating something called a 1-inch punch, starting with his fist 1 inch from a target. No wind-up, no chamber, no visible preparation of any kind. And then the target moved. Not gently, not politely. The man holding the wooden board stumbled backward nearly 6 feet. The physicist watched it again. Then he picked up the phone. The meeting was arranged through a chain of contacts that included a martial arts instructor in San Francisco, a film producer, and a man who'd once trained briefly with Lee in Seattle and couldn't stop talking about it. Bruce Lee agreed to be tested. He didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask what the tests involved. He just said when and where. That detail, that instant zero hesitation agreement, would later strike everyone in the room as the first sign that something unusual was happening. Most people, when told scientists wanted to measure their physical capabilities, felt performance anxiety. They hedged, they asked questions. Bruce Lee responded like a man who already knew what the machines would say. The lab was set up carefully. High-speed cameras, industrial equipment, the kind used to analyze mechanical failures in aerospace engineering, were positioned at multiple angles. Electronic sensors were placed at the strike target. A photosensitive trigger system was connected to a timer that could measure in fractions of milliseconds. They brought in 3 other test subjects for comparison: a professional boxer, a karate black belt with tournament credentials, and a younger research assistant who had competed in fencing at the collegiate level. They would all strike the same target. The machines would measure everything: speed of hand from rest position to contact, force of impact, time from initiation of movement to arrival. The boxer went first. His straight right, a textbook full extension power punch, registered impressive numbers: force well above average, speed that would have done serious damage in a real fight. The karate man went second. His strike was technically clean. The numbers were similar. Both men performed at roughly the upper range of what the research had predicted for trained athletes. The fencer was faster in initiation. The neurological go signal fired quicker, but his actual strike had less force transfer. Different discipline, different optimization. Then Bruce Lee walked to the mark. He stood there for a moment. Just stood there. The physicist noticed something later when reviewing the footage. In those few seconds before the strike, Bruce Lee's face was not focused. It wasn't tense. It wasn't concentrated in the way athletes look before a maximum effort. He looked bored. Not dismissive, not arrogant, just completely, utterly still inside, like a man waiting for a bus. He asked them to reset the sensor. He walked to the mark, 1 inch from the target. The room went quiet. The cameras rolled. And then, the target moved. The sound arrived a fraction of a second after the impact registered on the sensors. Nobody in the room spoke for a full 4 seconds. Then the physicist walked to his equipment and looked at the numbers. He looked at them again. He called his assistant over and pointed. His assistant looked, then looked at him, then looked back at the numbers. "Run it again," the physicist said. They ran it again. Same result. A third time. Same result. What the sensors had recorded was this: Bruce Lee's hand traveled the 1 inch distance from rest to full contact in 0.3 milliseconds on the first run. Not 0.3 seconds. Not 300 milliseconds. 0.3 milliseconds. The boxer's fastest punch had registered at 40 milliseconds from initiation to contact, and that was considered elite. The karate man, 38 milliseconds. The fencer's initiation was quicker, but his strike took longer, 55 milliseconds total. Bruce Lee, 0.3 milliseconds. The gap wasn't incremental. It wasn't faster than average. It wasn't gifted athlete outperforms peers. It was a different category of reality. The human nervous system, every textbook, every paper, every clinical study, cannot fire that fast. The electrochemical signal traveling from brain to muscle fiber takes longer than 0.3 milliseconds just to leave the brain. Which meant only one thing. Bruce Lee wasn't reacting when he struck. He had already struck before the decision to strike completed its journey through his nervous system. His body had learned to move before conscious thought.
This is where it gets complicated. This is where the story stops being about speed and starts being about something else entirely. Bruce Lee had a name for it. He didn't call it reflex. He didn't call it instinct. He called it Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of action without action, movement without interference from the thinking mind. He had been studying this concept since he was a teenager in Hong Kong, training under the legendary Ip Man, learning Wing Chun at a time when most boys his age were playing football in the streets. Ip Man had told him something once that most students heard as poetry and ignored as practical instruction. The fastest hand is the hand that does not know it is moving. Bruce Lee didn't hear it as poetry. He heard it as engineering. For years, through his time in Hong Kong, through his early days in Seattle, through late nights in the gymnasium when everyone else had gone home, he had been working to remove something from his body. Not to add strength, not to add speed in the traditional sense, to remove the gap between perceiving and responding, the gap between intention and execution, the gap that every human being carries inside their nervous system, that tiny, unavoidable delay between the brain saying go and the body going. He had spent years training that gap to zero. Not through repetition alone, through a specific kind of repetition that nobody else was doing. He wasn't drilling movements to make them faster. He was drilling movements to make them disappear from consciousness entirely. The boxer in that lab could punch at 40 milliseconds because his nervous system had been trained through thousands of repetitions to execute the punching pattern quickly. But the decision still had to travel, the signal still had to fire, the muscle still had to receive its instruction and contract. Bruce Lee had done something different. He had trained his body to exist in a state of pre-fired readiness, where the strike was not initiated by a decision, but by the absence of decision, where stillness itself was a loaded spring, and the slightest external trigger released it without the delay of conscious processing. The scientists had a term for this neurological state. It was called anticipatory motor programming, and it had been observed at low levels in elite musicians and professional athletes. But never at this magnitude, never at a speed that erased the processing gap entirely. Bruce Lee had not just trained faster than anyone else, he had trained in a fundamentally different direction. The physicist sat down. He was quiet for a long time. Bruce Lee was standing across the room, hands loose at his sides, watching him with that same expression, calm, patient, slightly curious, the way you look at someone who's just seen something that changes their understanding of the world, and you're waiting to see how they handle it. Finally, the physicist said, "How long did this take you?" Bruce Lee thought about it. "My whole life," he said. Then he picked up his jacket and left. The data was reviewed. It was reviewed again. It was sent to colleagues. It was questioned. It was challenged. The high-speed camera footage was analyzed frame by frame. The sensors were recalibrated and tested against known standards. Nothing was wrong. The number held. A paper was quietly drafted. It was never formally published. This was the early 1960s. Martial arts occupied no serious space in academic research, and the idea of submitting data about a Chinese-American kung fu instructor to a peer-reviewed journal struck most of the physicists' colleagues as professionally inadvisable. But the data existed. The footage existed. And for the rest of his life, that physicist, who went on to a distinguished career in biomechanics research, would tell the same story at academic conferences, always off the record, always with the same ending. I have never seen anything like it before or since, and I've spent 40 years trying to explain it. I still can't. But this was only the beginning, because word travels, especially word about impossible things. And the story of what happened in that lab, distorted, exaggerated, questioned, debated, began to move through the world in ways nobody could control. By 1966, it had reached the ears of a man who would decide to test Bruce Lee in a very different kind of laboratory. Not with sensors and cameras, with his fists. His name was not famous then. It would be later. And what happened between them in a gymnasium in Los Angeles, in front of fewer than 20 witnesses, would never be officially recorded, never be shown on camera, never be formally acknowledged by either man. But everyone who was in that room remembered it. Every single one of them.
Los Angeles, 1966. The gymnasium on South Figueroa Street didn't look like much from the outside. Peeling paint on the door, a hand-lettered sign, 2 bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling inside, casting everything in that particular shade of yellow that makes shadows look permanent. But inside that gym, on any given Tuesday evening, you would find some of the most dangerous men in Southern California. Boxers, wrestlers, judoka, Korean fighters who had come up through schools where you didn't stop sparring because you were bleeding. You stopped when the instructor said stop. They trained hard. They trained seriously. They did not impress easily. And on this particular Tuesday in the spring of 1966, every single one of them stopped what they were doing when the man walked through the door. His name was Calvin Reed, 6'2", 230 pounds of structured professional muscle. He had competed in full-contact karate tournaments across 3 states and hadn't lost in 14 months. He had trained in boxing, in wrestling, in judo. He was what people in that world called a complete fighter, before that phrase existed as a marketing term, before it meant anything commercial. He was also, by every account of people who knew him, an exceptionally proud man. Not arrogant in the petty sense, proud in the way that men who have earned something real through years of real suffering are sometimes proud. He believed in what his body could do.
And he had heard the story about the lab. He hadn't liked it. He hadn't come looking for trouble. That's what he told people afterward, and perhaps he believed it. But he had come with a specific question, delivered in the kind of tone that only sounds polite on the surface. Bruce Lee was in the back of the gym, running a small, informal class. 6 students, a mix of nationalities, all of them completely absorbed in what he was showing them about centerline theory and why the shortest distance between 2 points is only useful if your opponent doesn't know you know it. Reed walked to the edge of the group and waited. Bruce Lee noticed him immediately. He noticed everything immediately. This was documented by everyone who ever spent time around him. Not paranoia, not hypervigilance in the anxious sense, just a quality of awareness that seemed to process everything in the room simultaneously without effort. He finished his sentence, let his students practice, walked over. Reed was direct. "I've heard things about your speed," he said. "I want to see if they're true." Bruce Lee looked at him, took in the size, the posture, the controlled aggression wrapped in a thin layer of courtesy. "What things?" "That you can hit a man before he sees it coming." "I can." Reed smiled. The kind of smile that isn't warm. "I'd like to test that." The 6 students had stopped practicing. Word moved through the gym the way it always does in those places, without being spoken aloud. Within 90 seconds, every person in that building had drifted toward the back, training pretense abandoned, everyone suddenly very interested in what was happening in the corner. 18 people. Maybe 19. Nobody thought to count. Nobody thought to bring a camera. This would matter later. Bruce Lee looked at Reed for a long moment, not sizing him up. He'd already done that the moment Reed walked through the door. He was doing something else, something that people who watched him often described but struggled to explain. He was deciding whether the situation required what Reed was asking for. He concluded that it did. "All right," he said. But then something happened that nobody expected. Bruce Lee held up one finger. "Before we do this," he said, "I want to explain something to you. Not as a warning, as information." Reed crossed his arms. Waited. "What I do is not a trick. People hear the story and they think it's a trick. Muscle tension at the right moment, camera angle, sensor malfunction. I've heard all of it." He paused. "It isn't a trick. And I need you to understand that before we start, because if you don't understand it, you'll spend the next 10 minutes trying to catch something that cannot be caught, and that will make this unpleasant for you." Reed said nothing. Someone in the watching crowd shifted their weight. "The reason you can't stop it," Bruce Lee continued, his voice completely level, completely conversational, as if he were discussing weather patterns or restaurant recommendations, "is not because I'm faster than you. It's because by the time your eye sends the signal to your brain, and your brain sends the signal to your arm, I am already finished." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "You won't be slow. You'll just be second." Reed uncrossed his arms. "Show me," he said. They faced each other. Reed was in a fighting stance, experienced, solid, weight properly distributed, hands positioned the way a man positions his hands when he actually knows what he's doing. Bruce Lee stood almost casually, weight slightly back, hands low. The stance that looked to people who didn't know like he wasn't ready. He was always ready. Reed had decided on his strategy before he walked across the gym. He was going to watch Bruce Lee's shoulder. Every punch begins in the shoulder. That's where the telegraph lives. That's where the earliest possible warning signal originates. If he tracked the shoulder, he would catch the movement at its source. He had done this successfully against faster opponents than Bruce Lee. He had blocked strikes that most people said were unblockable. He watched the shoulder. He waited. He was ready. Bruce Lee's fist arrived at his chest. Reed hadn't seen the shoulder move. He hadn't seen anything move. He had simply felt the impact. Sharp, precise, delivered to a specific point 2 inches below his sternum, before any visual information had reached his brain at all. He stepped back, not because the force knocked him back, because his body made the decision independently of his mind. The room was silent. Reed looked down at his chest, then up at Bruce Lee. "Again," he said. This time, Reed changed his approach. He'd heard that Bruce Lee's strikes originated without shoulder telegraph. Fine. He widened his focus, stopped watching any single point, used peripheral vision to capture the whole body simultaneously, a technique he'd learned from a Japanese sensei who'd spent 40 years teaching people to see without looking. He was genuinely good at this. He waited. He watched. He was ready. Bruce Lee's fist arrived at his solar plexus. Reed hadn't seen the arm extend, hadn't seen the weight shift, hadn't seen anything. He'd felt the impact, and then, in the half-second afterward, his body had registered what his mind was still trying to process. He breathed out, slowly. The gym remained completely silent. 18 people who made their living in violent physical disciplines, standing motionless, watching something they had no category for. Reed was not a man who showed emotion easily, but his face had changed. "One more," Reed said. His voice was different now. The edge was gone. What replaced it was something harder to name, a kind of intense, focused hunger, the expression of a man who has encountered something real and wants to understand it. "This time," he said, "I'm going to grab your wrist before you strike." Bruce Lee nodded. "You can try," he said, not mockingly, factually. They reset. Reed's plan was precise. He was going to initiate his grab at the very first microsecond of Bruce Lee's movement, not react to the strike, but intercept the arm before it reached full extension. He was fast enough to do this against normal opponents. His grab was one of the things people in that gym talked about. He could intercept a committed strike mid-travel. He focused, narrowed everything down to the space between them. He watched. He was ready. He was already moving when he realized Bruce Lee's wrist had been at his sternum for what felt like, though it was impossible, a full second before he saw the strike begin. His hand closed around air. Reed stood there. He unclenched his fist. He looked at the air where his grab had landed. Then he started laughing. It wasn't the laughter of a man who'd been made a fool of. It was the laughter of a man who had just encountered something so far outside his framework for reality that the only available response was to find it funny. Pure, almost bewildered laughter, the kind that fills a room. And then slowly, the rest of the gym joined him. Not mockingly, not at Reed's expense. They were laughing because they'd all just seen the same impossible thing, and none of them knew what else to do with it. Bruce Lee watched all of this with that characteristic stillness, the faintest smile. Patient, as if he'd seen this reaction before, as if he understood exactly what they were experiencing, and found it, not amusing exactly, but familiar. "How?" Reed finally said, when the laughter had settled. Bruce Lee sat down on a nearby bench, which surprised everyone, the informality of it, the immediate de-escalation from the intensity of what had just happened. "Come sit down," he said. Reed said. "The mistake everyone makes," Bruce Lee said, "is they think about it as speed." He picked up a towel from the bench beside him, held it loosely. Speed is part of it, but speed is the result, not the cause. He held the towel at one end and let it hang. When you swing a towel, the tip moves faster than your hand, but you don't make the tip fast. You make the base move correctly, and the speed arrives at the tip by itself. He set the towel down. Every fighter in this room has practiced making their arm fast. I practiced making the decision disappear. Reed leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means," Bruce Lee said, "that by the time I am deciding to strike, I have already struck. The decision and the action are the same moment. There is no gap between them." He paused. "You were watching for the beginning of my movement, but the beginning of my movement happened before I knew I was moving." The room was completely quiet again. You cannot catch the beginning of something that has no beginning. This is the part that the lab data captured, but couldn't explain. The sensors measured 0.3 milliseconds, correctly, accurately. That number was real. But what the sensors couldn't measure, what no instrument in that era could quantify, was the neurological state that made that number possible. Bruce Lee had spent years dismantling a very specific thing inside himself. In conventional training, there is a sequence. Perceive, decide, execute. You see an opening. You decide to strike. You strike. Even at elite levels, even when the sequence is compressed by thousands of hours of drilling, it is still a sequence. 3 beats, 3 steps, 3 moments separated by electrochemical time. Bruce Lee had collapsed the sequence, not to 2 steps, to 1. He had trained himself into a state where perceiving an opening and striking into that opening were the same neurological event. There was no decision step. The body moved in the moment of perception, before the conscious mind had formed an intention. This is what the Taoist concept of Wu Wei actually means, stripped of mystical language and translated into biomechanics, the removal of interference, the execution of action without the friction of deliberation. Buddhist teachers had been describing this state for 2,000 years. Bruce Lee had found a way to train it into his nervous system through methodical, obsessive, years-long physical practice. He had turned philosophy into physiology. Calvin Reed trained with Bruce Lee for the next 3 months. He never matched what he'd seen that evening in the gymnasium. He came to understand, gradually, that what Bruce Lee had achieved was not a technique that could be copied in 90 days.
It was the accumulated result of a specific philosophy applied to a specific kind of training over the better part of a decade. But he became a different fighter. Everyone who spent serious time with Bruce Lee came away changed in the same way, not because they learned his speed, but because he showed them that the ceiling they believed in was a ceiling they had built themselves. He expanded what they thought was possible. And then they went back to their gyms and knocked a few inches off their own personal ceiling. That was in a quiet way his greatest power.
By 1967, the story had split into two streams. The first stream was the data, the lab results, the measured numbers. These traveled through academic and scientific channels, quietly, cautiously, cited in footnotes and referenced in biomechanics papers under careful, hedged language. Anomalous results obtained from a non-standard subject. Data inconsistent with established models of neuromuscular response speed. Requires further study. Further study never quite arrived. Bruce Lee became a film star. The laboratory context of his abilities became obscured by the cinematic context. He became an icon, which is a different thing from being understood. The second stream was the myth. This traveled faster, through gyms and training halls, through late-night conversations between fighters, through the kind of oral tradition that martial arts communities maintain more carefully than they maintain written records. The details changed with each retelling. The 0.3 millisecond number became 0.1, then the blink of an eye, then faster than a human being can perceive. The location of the lab changed, the scientist changed, the audience changed, but the core of the story, a man who moved faster than the human nervous system was supposed to allow, remained constant, because that core was true. Here is what can be verified. Bruce Lee was filmed extensively under controlled conditions during the production of his films, and the footage, analyzed decades later with modern frame rate analysis tools, consistently shows strike speeds that remain anomalous compared to professional fighters recorded under similar conditions. His one-inch punch was studied and documented. The biomechanical efficiency of the movement, the specific sequencing of hip, shoulder, elbow, wrist, and knuckle, represents an optimization of force transfer that modern sports scientists describe as essentially perfect. No wasted motion, no energy leak, maximum force delivered to minimum surface area. People who sparred with him, documented accounts from students, colleagues, professional fighters who trained alongside him, described the same experience Reed described in that gymnasium, not being hit harder than they expected, being hit before they registered the strike had begun. The 0.3 millisecond figure appears in multiple independent accounts from the 1960s. It has been questioned. It has been challenged. It has never been definitively refuted, because the original data no longer exists in recoverable form. What exists is the testimony, consistent, independent, arriving from people with nothing to gain from exaggeration. What exists is the footage. And what exists is the philosophy, recorded in Bruce Lee's own handwriting in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, in interviews, in letters to students, that describes exactly the neurological state that would produce exactly the capabilities people witnessed. He wrote it down. He explained it. He left the blueprint. Most people read it as inspiration. He meant it as instruction. Bruce Lee died in 1973. He was 32 years old. The scientific community never produced a formal study of his capabilities during his lifetime. The cultural context wasn't right. The academic frameworks for taking martial arts seriously as a subject of biomechanical research didn't yet exist. They exist now. And the researchers who have gone back, who have analyzed the footage, who have read the training notes, who have traced the philosophy through its Taoist and Buddhist roots and out the other side into modern sports neuroscience, have arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. He was right. Not approximately right. Not metaphorically right. Technically, scientifically, measurably right. The fastest path between decision and action is the elimination of decision. The highest level of any physical skill is its disappearance from conscious control. The ceiling that human beings believe in, for speed, for reaction time, for the gap between intention and execution, is not a ceiling at all. It is a habit. And habits can be broken. Bruce Lee didn't just demonstrate that. He built a methodology for it. He wrote it down. He spent his life teaching it to anyone willing to go far enough into the discomfort of unlearning everything they already knew. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. But strip away the name, strip away the mythology, strip away the films and the posters and the cultural icon and the legend. What you are left with is a man who sat with a single question for 20 years. How fast can a human being actually move? And then worked backward from the answer. The answer was faster than anyone had measured, faster than the equipment could catch, faster in that laboratory on Long Island in 1962 than the scientists could explain. They ran the numbers 3 times. The number never changed. And somewhere in Los Angeles, in a gymnasium on South Figueroa Street, a man named Calvin Reed sat on a bench next to Bruce Lee and tried to understand how his fist had arrived before it left. He never fully understood it. Nobody did. Maybe that was the point. Some things don't need to be understood. They need to be witnessed. And once witnessed, they cannot be forgotten. If this story hit different, if you felt something shift in how you think about human limitation and what's actually possible inside a human body, then you're exactly who this channel is built for. We don't do surface-level content here. We go deep into the moments history almost missed, the rooms nobody filmed, the confrontations that were witnessed by 20 people and remembered by all 20 for the rest of their lives. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because the next story we're telling, it makes this one look quiet. Don't miss it.